Hey guys, this is Khatak CG. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I made this Lord of the Rings style environment in Blender 5.0. Growing up, the Lord of the Rings wasn't just a movie for me, it was a world I completely disappeared into. The landscapes, the scale, the sense of ancient history, it all stayed with me. And now, years later, working in 3D, recreating that feeling has always been a dream of mine. So this scene is my tribute, not a copy, but a Lord of the Rings inspired environment that captures the mood, the scale, and that sense of timeless fantasy. In this video, I'll break down exactly how I built this environment in Blender, from the terrain and rocks, to lighting, composition, and final atmosphere. By the end of this video, you will understand the full workflow behind this scene, and you will be able to apply it to create your own environments. Let's jump into the process. Every environment I create starts the same way, with a strong reference. Before opening Blender, I spent time finding an image that captures the mood, scale, and storytelling I'm aiming for. For this scene, this reference immediately stood out to me. The massive guardian statues, the dramatic cliffs, and the sense of ancient history were exactly the feeling I wanted to recreate. Once I had this reference logged in, I used it as a visual guide throughout the entire process, from blocking the sea to detailing, lighting, and atmosphere. With that in place, let's start building the environment. The first thing I do inside Blender is use the default cube to figure out the scale of the statues based on the reference image. I'm not worried about details at this stage, I'm only trying to understand how tall and massive these forms need to feel in the scene. By comparing the statues to the surrounding cliffs and landscape in the reference, I could roughly block out their proportions. In the final scene, each statue ended up being around 200 meters tall, so locking in that scale early helped everything else fall into place naturally. Once the scale felt right, I could start shaping the terrain and composition around it without constantly resizing later. I began by creating two separate ground planes, one for the foreground and one for the midground. This gave me more control over the depth of the scene and helped clearly separate the different layers of the environment. In the foreground, I added a simple low poly horse inspired by the reference image to help sell the scale and add a bit of storytelling. At the same time, I kept adjusting the camera, moving it around and changing the focal length until the composition felt right. For the final shot, I settled on a 30 mm focal length, which gave me a wide cinematic feel without distorting the scene too much. With the camera logged in, I started building out the surrounding cliffs using 3D scanned rocks and cliff assets from Quixel Bridge. These scanned models made it much easier to create massive, believable cliffs around the scene, especially at this scale. I've used these assets in many of my previous renders, and they have been incredibly helpful for quickly adding realism and detail. For this environment, the Quixel cliff and rock scans played a huge role in shaping the landscape and grounding the scene in reality. One issue I ran into was that the cliff and rock assets didn't all share the same color. Some were more reddish, some lighter, and the other dark gray. To unify the scene, I adjusted their textures using a hue saturation node, bringing all the rocks into a consistent color range. After that, I mixed in a grass texture using a mix shader. For the mix factor, I used the normal output from the geometry node passed through a separate XYZ node and used the Z output as the mask. This way, the grass texture only appears on upward facing surfaces and doesn't wrap around the vertical sides of the cliffs and rocks. Once the environment was in place, I moved on to lighting the scene using Blender 5.0's new sky texture with multiple scattering enabled. This gave me much more realistic atmospheric lighting and softer light transitions across the scene. To control the mood, I placed large rock assets behind the camera to block direct sunlight from hitting the foreground. This created a colder, indirect lighting in the foreground, but later on I adjusted this in the final lighting pass. Since the shadow heavy foreground wasn't working visually, to help guide the viewers, I also added a subtle spotlight on one of the statue's head, making it stand out more clearly from the surrounding environment. After locking in the lighting, I moved on to adding detail and life to the scene. I used Blender's particle system along with weight painting to precisely scatter wild grass, bushes, and rocks across both the foreground and the midground. This gave me full control over the vegetation appears, helping me keep important areas clean while adding density where it mattered. On top of that, I did some custom texture painting to carve out a path through the scene. using a dirt texture to naturally guide the viewer's eye towards the statues. To add more life to the environment, I introduced horses with subtle animations. I started with a single horse asset that included multiple animation clips. From there, I duplicated the main horse and assigned different animations to each one, some walking, some sleeping, and others grazing. These small animated details helped make the environment feel alive, even though the scene itself is mostly static. For the final polish, I moved into Blender's Compositor to handle post-processing. I started by using a mist pass to add atmospheric fog in the distance with a very subtle blue tint to enhance depth and scale. To enhance the highlights, I used two glare nodes, one set to streaks and another set to blue, keeping both effects very controlled. After that, I used a color balance node to push the colors slightly, making the scene feel richer and more vibrant without overdoing it. Finally, I added a subtle vignette to darken the corners and a touch of lens distortion to give the image a more realistic cinematic finish. And that's how I created this Lord of the Rings inspired environment in Blender, from reference and scale all the way to lighting, animation, and final compositing. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more environment breakdowns, Blender workflows, and cinematic 3D content, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or if there's a specific environment you'd like me to break down next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.